Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the life and reign of King Edward II. In this episode, The Queen's Revenge, we will talk about how the king used his victory over his cousin Lancaster to punish his real and imagined enemies. One of those enemies, Roger Mortimer, escaped and joined forces with Edward's disgruntled queen Isabella. Together they invaded England, disposed of the Despensers, and eventually removed and probably murdered Edward II. For much of his reign, Edward II enraged the great lords of England with his shameless favoritism, first to Piers Gaveston and then to the Despenser family. The two Despenser men, Hugh the Elder and Hugh the Younger, cheated lords out of their inheritances, kidnapped people for ransom, and even engaged in outright piracy against merchant ships. Worst of all, since they were the king's favorites, they got away with everything. When Edward II tried to give estates in Wales to Hugh Despenser the Younger, Edward's own cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, revolted. After crushing his cousin's army, Edward had Lancaster executed, and soon anyone entering an English town would have seen one of the great men of the realm strung up like a butchered hog for the crime of supporting Lancaster. At a parliament in May 1322, the king continued his revenge on those who dared come between him and his favorites. One by one, all the lords who sided with Lancaster had their estates seized. Some estates went to Edward's sons and supporters, but the Despensers, of course, got the richest rewards. Hugh the Elder became the Earl of Winchester, while Hugh the Younger received much of the Earldom of Gloucester. By the end of 1322, the Despenser family controlled more than half of Wales. King Edward II himself prospered. He held many estates taken from the rebel lords, along with their tax revenues. King Edward II became the richest king of England since William the Conqueror. With the king so wealthy he didn't have to worry about making the nobles happy, he became even more treacherous than before. After so many plots against him, Edward II saw enemies everywhere. The former Lady of Lancaster, wife to the cousin he executed, was threatened with being burned at the stake if she did not hand over her estate to the Despensers. Andrew Harclay, who had captured Lancaster, was found to have opened negotiations with the Scots in the hopes of ending the long war. Edward punished him for this slight by having him hung, drawn, and quartered. Yet one of Edward's victims escaped. Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, one of the Marcher lords who had ruled Wales until the Despensers began snapping up estates, was put in the Tower of London for siding with Lancaster. In August 1323, Mortimer paid a man to slip his guard a sleeping potion. That man then hurried to Mortimer's cell and let him out. When the two men reached the top of the wall, they unfurled a rope ladder and climbed down towards the river. Upon coming to a waiting boat, they made their way to France. Once word reached Edward that a rebel had escaped the strongest prison in England, he became terrified. Edward even considered leading an army to France, but he could not. After all, no one profited from his reign except a few favorites, so he could not trust his own subjects to keep the peace if he left. So Edward instead ordered the arrest of all Frenchmen living in England. Among those to suffer was Edward's own wife, Isabella of France. The Despensers, sensing a chance to grow even richer, seized her estates, exiled her servants, and even King Edward cut her allowance, forcing her to live little better than a maidservant. Hugh Despenser's wife, Eleanor de Clare, even spied on the Queen's letter writing. Some scholars even think that Hugh Despenser the Younger forced himself upon the Queen, which would explain her hatred for him. Yet despite his favorite's humiliation of Isabella, King Edward still sent his queen to France in 1325 to secure Mortimer's return. Ecstatic to return to her homeland, Isabella made a ceremonial entry into Paris, dressed in a golden headdress, black riding habit, and checkered boots. While Isabella renewed the truce between England and France, she could do nothing about Mortimer. Indeed, Isabella's brother, King Charles of France, expected Edward to travel to France to pay him homage for lands that Edward held in Gascony. Still frightened to leave a kingdom where so many hated him, King Edward instead sent his eldest son, Edward of Windsor. Then something unexpected happened. Isabella refused to return to her weak, unpleasant husband and his vicious favorites. Rather, she met with other English lords exiled to France. Among them was Roger Mortimer. Within weeks, Isabella and Mortimer became lovers, even appearing in public together. Edward II grew more paranoid, wondering if the French now planned an invasion. He wrote furious letters to Isabella, demanding her return and that of his son and heir, Edward III. Isabella did return to England in September 1326 in the company of 700 Dutch and German mercenaries on 95 ships. For a strong king, a relatively small force would not be a problem, yet Edward's cruelty had turned most of the English lords against him. Copies of a letter written by Queen Isabella appeared on windows across England, offering a rich reward to anyone who brought her the Despensers who had humiliated her so much. In October 1326, Londoners rose up against the Despenser flunkies running their city. The Bishop of Exeter, a former royal treasurer, tried to escape the city while riding in full armor. Men dragged him from his horse, ripped his armor from his body, and cut off his head with a bread knife. With London secure, Isabella and Mortimer led their army west. Edward and the Despensers fled to their power base in Wales, calling up the Welsh lords for service against Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer. Meanwhile, the Queen and Mortimer lay siege to Bristol Castle, where Hugh the Despenser the Elder had holed up. Though the elder Despenser frantically tried to bargain for his life, the rebel army took the castle by siege and led out the king's favorite in chains. The younger Despenser tried to flee with King Edward II to Ireland. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella took advantage of this, writing that since her husband had fled England, her son should take over the throne. Conveniently, she and Mortimer would serve as regents. One of Isabella's first acts as regent was to put Hugh the Elder on trial for treason and robbery. It was yet another show trial, with Despenser refused the right to speak in his defense. Afterwards, he was hung, drawn, and quartered. First, he was hung by the neck until almost dead, then he was stretched on the rack, and afterwards torturers cut open his belly, removed his intestines, and then burned them on the wooden platform before they cut off his arms and legs. In November 1326, rebel ships caught up with Edward's boat when it washed ashore after the failed voyage to Ireland. Hugh Despenser the Younger came to Hereford to face trial. As he approached the courthouse, a mob dragged him to the ground, tore off his clothes, and wrote Bible verses on his skin. Then he was hauled before the court. Like his father, the younger Despenser was hung, drawn, and quartered. The Queen and Mortimer roped him to 4 horses and dragged him through the streets before hoisting him onto a 50-foot gallows to face his punishment. The fate of Edward II himself remained uncertain. He was shut up at Kenilworth Castle, where he spent most of his time raving about treason and swearing to murder his wife if he ever got his hands on her. In a desperate attempt to cling to power, Edward refused to go to any parliament, fearing they would depose him. That left Isabella and Mortimer in a tough spot. On the one hand, Edward had shown himself incapable of ruling England, yet their government could not function without a lawful monarch. So Roger Mortimer created the charge that Edward was lovers with the Despenser men. Though we have no way to know for certain if this was true or not, the leading bishops of England used it as a convenient excuse to declare Edward unfit for the throne. Feeling they could now rightly appoint a new king, Parliament swore loyalty to 14-year-old King Edward III. A delegation of 24 lords met the king in Kenilworth, telling him of what happened. Edward was shocked, baffled, and reduced to tears. In the end, the lords warned him that if Edward failed to abdicate, they couldn't put his son on the throne, and the Plantagenet dynasty would end. By the time Edward finally agreed to abdicate, he was so grief-stricken that he had to be held up as he signed his abdication. After giving up the crown, Edward was moved to a dungeon in Berkeley Castle. Yet his former favorites, likely fearing justice under a new king, made 3 attempts to free Edward II from captivity. Those plots finally ended when Edward II died very suddenly in September 1327 under mysterious circumstances. Since his son Edward III was busy with Parliament, Edward II would not be buried until December of 1327. Kept out of the Plantagenet family tomb at Westminster Abbey, Edward II was buried in his coronation clothes at St. Peter's Abbey. While the official line became that Edward had died very suddenly of illness, it did not take long for people to suspect murder, especially since Isabella and Mortimer had so much to gain and nothing to lose by Edward's death. If he was murdered, Edward II was most likely smothered with a pillow, as that would leave no marks. Yet, as propaganda pushed the idea that he took first Gaveston and then the Despensers as lovers, a new tradition emerged that the Queen had executed Edward II by inserting a red-hot poker up his bottom and then roasting him from the inside. In any case, the life and reign of Edward II had ended. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.